Hey everyone, welcome to week 5. We are going to be jumping into chapter 7. As I told you before, I'm only taking a certain number of chapters, recognizing that we don't have that much time to actually explore all of them. So I'm taking some of the pertinent ones, and those are what we're going to explore over the last couple of weeks, last few weeks of school, and you'll also be doing discussions on these chapters as well, and I'll talk about that more in a different announcement that I'll send out to class this week. But chapter 7 looks at Europe and its relationship to the modern world, and we can actually say that in truth Europe has been the catalyst for America in many ways being America. A lot of the ideas, both good and bad, that reside in our country, the struggles we have, are derived from our experience through the European legacy, and even globally. There have been many positive effects that Europe has brought to the world with modernization and innovation and political systems and all types of things that they have brought, economic success and theories and ideas of democracy and liberalism and conservatism. We've all benefited and learned tremendously from the European historical context. However, there's also some things they have left that have been problematic, particularly with colonialism and also with regard to decisions that they've made internationally. For example, the Israeli-Palestinian crisis that we live with today, and that's been so prevalent in the news, is a direct result of a decision made by Britain, or by the Brits, with a very famous paper called the Balfour Declaration, where they decided that they were going to place the European Jews that were being persecuted into an area that was already inhabited by Palestinian Jews, without asking them. And so therein starts the disaster that has taken place since that time. So a lot of it has directly the consequences of these some of the decisions by world powers, like the Europeans, have had consequences that have been far-reaching long after their direct impact or direct control of those areas has left. So let's jump into this a little bit and take a look at Europe. There's obviously a lot to cover, so we'll be sure to make sure that we can't cover it all in this chapter, but we will definitely touch on the things that are important. So first, obviously, is to understand its direct impact, and obviously the idea of its global reach and its impact to the global system. As I said earlier, with regard to the economics, the geographic impacts, the political, cultural, historical, cultural, all those aspects that allow a country or entity to grow and develop. Europe has been the focal point and catalyst for that change. Certainly, with regard to that, we can also say it's the established aspects of the modern world, like agricultural production, as you see here on the slide, development of currency-based trade, the exchange of goods and services, and the development of industry and technological achievements have all been derived from the European experience, particularly from the mid 15th, 16th century up through the 20th century. Now, geographically, of course, you can, in fact, let me jump to the next slide. Actually, you can see where Europe is, and most of you should know, or I would assume you would know where Europe is now. If you were in New York and you decided you wanted to swim, fly, or drive to cross the Atlantic, you would wind up in Europe. And as you can see, it runs from the north of Norway and Sweden and Finland all the way south to the Straits of Gibraltar and east to the Bosphorus, which is Turkey. And so it's a fairly large landmass, and there are about, I think, 500 million people who reside in there approximately now. So let's talk about the historical context first. And I'm going to kind of take you through a short, brisk walk through the early part of the development of Europe and then moving into the 20th century. But certainly its traditions go back to the Judeo-Christian traditions of ancient Europe, right? So you're talking about the Greco-Roman period and the establishments of democracy, laws, development of political systems, which were rife during that time in the early, and probably, or you could probably say from about 1000 BC, maybe a little later, up until the beginning of the Common Era, also known as CE. You see this rapid rise and growth of and development of the early empires of Europe. And then as we start to develop and we get into the first millennium, there are certainly many catalysts for change as we go from empires and the struggle of power for power that we saw, for example, even from moving from the ancient Greeks, who were the founding fathers of democracy and classifying different types of political systems, to the Roman Empire, where you saw this struggle between those who wanted to have an empire and those who wanted to have democratic practices. And so you go from the emperors like Caligula or Nero or Julius Caesar, and then to try to find a way for the Senate in Rome to have shared governance. And it's interesting to note because from that time forward, it's always been a struggle to decide who's going to lead and how much power should the people have in the system. You know, it's interesting to note that throughout this period of the new millennia, that through all the various social, economic, religious upheaval that occurred, it's tremendous. I mean, from the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, which basically the king decides to share a little bit of protections and rights to the barons, the land barons, all the way up through the Peace of Westphalia after the 30-Year War that gave defined territories to some of these entities that had been living as city-states and so forth. And there's lots of other things that happened during this period. There's significant political writing from various philosophers and theorists during this period. But there are a couple of things that I'm going to touch on here during this time, just because for brevity's sake. And one is the Reformation, because as you know, the church had a tremendous impact throughout this time in Europe. It actually had continued from the time of the post-Roman Empire all the way up through even to today. But during the Reformation period was a time when the split from the Catholic Church, by virtue of the writings of Martin Luther and John Calvin, it sets up this division which creates the Protestant religions and the understanding of Christianity and the interpretation of Christianity based on the writings and teachings of Martin Luther and John Calvin, as opposed to the Catholic Church, which had tremendous political ties, economic ties, social ties, and also had been enduring a significant amount of corruption during this period. So this is one of the major catalysts that existed or happened during this period. The next major event that takes place during this period is the Renaissance. And I'm sure you've heard the term, and maybe many of you may know what it is, but just to help you sort of get along, it really was a cultural movement. And it was seen as a departure from the old ways of Europe and focusing on the modern context. It runs to pretty much arguably from the late 14th century all the way to the 17th century. And it was, when we say a cultural shift or a cultural movement, we're talking about all aspects of culture. So, an awareness of history and art and music and intellectual pursuits, philosophy. There were issues of politics, understanding what diplomacy was, and the various customs and conventions even looking at science and scientific inquiry. So it was really sort of an age of enlightenment, of engagement, of rising, or I should say, of looking at the rising of the development of Europe as not only a global power, but also an intellectual power. And so this was the beginning of a development that showed an appreciation of all these different aspects of human existence. And so it was a very important pivotal point in terms of driving the changes that result in Europe going forward from that point. So certainly, as I've said, all these different innovations that are the catalyst for European modernization that starts during this period of time and continues on through the 20th century. Now, it's interesting to note, by the time you get to the 18th, 19th century, the great empires of Europe had expanded all the way around the world. So many of the great European countries, England, France, Germany, the Dutch, Spain, they had all spread out and had territories around the world. So Middle East, Africa, Asia, were all, and even into America, of course, were all controlled by and touched by European powers. And this is what we call colonialism. So basically the way it worked was you had someone from that country who was the governor of the country they were basically controlling. So for example, in Egypt, there was a British governor who controlled Egypt and basically exploited the resources of Egypt and exploited the people as well. And the colonial period basically runs from the late Middle Ages all the way until the end of World War II, for most cases. So several hundred years of the European countries controlling vast lands and territories around the world. And so, of course, we know that there's also, as the world is getting smaller with technological innovation, of course, Britain runs into a war with us. But inside of Europe itself, there were many civil wars and crises that had happened throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. And it's interesting because there were so many what they would call conferences, or concerts rather, that were basically, they would come together, all these countries, and try to figure out how to avoid war by basically saying, okay, if one of the countries decides to act stupid, all the other countries would get together to counter against it. It sounded like a wonderful plan, but it never worked out properly. And it didn't work out properly because there were a lot of things that were changing in Europe during this time. As I said, because of the Renaissance period, most of these countries had started to evolve and develop their own identities. And by the late 19th century, they all had aspects of wanting to control their own destinies. And while they were willing to work together to collaborate on some aspects like trade or things like this, there were distinct differences from country to country. And certainly the idea of understanding the concept of what it meant to be a nation was important. That played a huge role in this. And even the idea of what it meant to be a state, because this had all evolved in just a couple of hundred years. So the sense of identity, of identifying yourself by virtue of your state or your country, if you would, as well as the nation, became incredibly important. And these actually are the catalysts for the wars that lead us into the 20th century. So real quickly here, the idea of understanding the difference between a nation and a state, sometimes they're used interchangeably. In fact, sometimes in political science, they will call countries nation states. But, it's important to understand the distinct difference because a state is a governing political structure. So the state, like the United States, has a political structure that allows for it to have, we have a federal democracy that allows for the entities or the 50 states that are comprised, that make up the United States, to have a representative system to be able to interact with the federal government. That's a structure. That's what defines the state of our country. The nation is a group of people. And this is really interesting to understand, because the idea of understanding the importance of the identity that is associated with these groups of people, these individual groups, cannot be understated. So it's a very loaded term. It has lots of implications, that in terms of how you define ethnic groups within a nation, in terms of the status of minorities within these ethnic groups, how the states dominate one national group or ethnic group over another. But it's much more driven by the historical legacies and the idea of whether real or imagined, the concepts of the legacies of countries like our own. So, for example, when you talk about the ideas of of what makes, how we feel about our country, and there's lots of symbolic images, right? So we have the flag, we have various songs we sing, and yet understanding that is important, because there's a lot of emotion that is derived from the context of understanding how we feel about ourselves as people, and what drives our belief system about how we see ourselves as people within this country. And some of it's driven by mythology. The founders certainly tried to create an image to suggest economic vitality, strength, all these different aspects that would make distinct a certain amount of pride within the country, within who we are as people. And sometimes this can take on a life of its own in a very frightening way, particularly when you look at what happens in the early 20th century with the rise of nationalism in Germany, for example, which leads to Nazism, the rise of communism. All these things are aspects that were derived from the development of nations, which then brings on this idea of what we call nationalism. And nationalism is an important component of understanding the whole context of political systems that are evolving to threaten democracy. Now, understanding that from the 19th and 20th century, certainly you could argue that most of Europe were liberal democracies. And when we say liberal democracies, we're just talking about the institutions of government, that you have rules of law, you had a separate judiciary, you had a framework for a Congress or legislative body, you had protections. And so it was really just like in our own country, the liberal institutions, not liberal in the context of liberal versus conservative, but liberal in the idea that you had a rule of law, the majority rule. So when you vote, whoever the majority vote for should win. You had equality under the law. So all these things are aspects of what make a liberal democracy a liberal democracy. Certainly we see this, the evolution or de-evolution of this, as we see, as I mentioned earlier, when the rise of colonialism from the Middle Ages all the way to the early 20th century. And then by World War II, when all these countries in Europe basically can no longer afford to hold on to their assets in other parts of the world, we see what's called decolonialism, and we see the rise of nationalism in these countries. So they had, for example, in the Middle East, they had Pan-Arabism, they called it. In Africa, they called it Pan-Africanism. And these basically are a rising of national nationalism, meaning that the people in those countries were looking to re-identify themselves as individuals within those countries and be separated from European rule. The problem was that they had been so conditioned and socialized through the European systems that they still carry nuances of those systems today. Even as they reject them out of hand, they are still endemic in many of the cultures that have come to hate them or disdain them. So this is the struggle, and certainly the struggle has been now the greatest threat, arguably, to democracy in the way that we understand it. It has been the rise of nationalism, and through this we have seen these iterations through wars and conflicts. Now, understanding that nationalism, of course, when you think about it in context, I want to give you a little sort of theoretical, philosophical premise here. As it shows in the chart here, it really has a lot to do with, your family and how you learn what you learn about who you are individually or as a people or as a group. And so a lot of the things that, this is how we sort of mobilize ourselves as people toward whatever common goals we want to achieve. It doesn't have to be based on reality, though, as I said earlier. It can certainly and frequently is based on myth and as they say, emotion rather than rational thinking. And this is one of the dangerous parts about it. So when people, even today, when we talk about what took place in January at the Capitol, or the rise of these conspiracy theories, these are all challenges that are based on emotion but not on sound reasoning. And so that's the danger, because human beings have a tendency to respond to things not based on sound logic or reasoning, but based on emotion. It'd be surprising to find out how many things that we have come to revere in America that are based on mythology, not on truth. But you'd be surprised. It's relatively significant, the number of things. As I said, continuing that, of course, nationalism has been considered the historic enemy of democracy, and not just in Europe, but around the world. And so this has been the struggle we have, and this also led to the rise of these other systems like communism, socialism, particularly with Karl Marx in the 19th century, who, as you read about earlier in the class, came up with this idea of notion of class-based identity as opposed to looking at national identity. And he was trying to unwind and look at the failures of democratic systems and to embrace the ideas of the new socialism, communist systems that he was writing about in his books. It also shows the failure of the imperialist systems that were being driven by the sense of nationalist pride that led to various entities in Europe to be competing with one another on all various spectrums of life. So, of course, then we go into World War I. We're in the early 20th century, and, of course, there are lots of different barriers now to democracy. It's ironic when everybody's trying to get to somewhere where we have equality and shared governance, and there's all this pushback, which just says a lot about human nature throughout history. But as you can see, they talk about for example, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that basically led to the first, what they call a communist state. The fascist rises in Italy and Germany, rise of Nazism, the appeal of Hitler, the failure of the democratic system in Germany that led because of nationalism, and along with the things that fall under that, which continue to contend with racism and militarism, and of course focusing on social divisions or ethnic divisions, just like they did with the Jews in Germany. The rise of authoritarian systems. As a matter of fact, one of the contentions of failed democracies is that they lead to authoritarian or totalitarian systems when they fail. The example they use here is General Franco in Spain, who ruled for probably close to 40 or 50 years in Spain. So there was a tremendous push, and it was hard to get back to some democratic principles after these some of these countries had their taste of power under communist or socialist systems. And then World War II happens, right? As I said before, the seeds of one event can lead to the next, and certainly World War II was built on the unresolved issues of World War I, and that led to the rise of Hitler, that then led to the war. And, at the end of the war, of course, the West wins, but the ideas of understanding of the systems were changing. So after World War II, Europe was carved up, and part of it was given to the West, and part of it was given to the East, to Soviet Union controlled part, and the Western alliance of countries looking at the United States. And Europe, Western Europe, controlled the other part. And so this sets up what we famously became known as the Cold War. And the Cold War was not an actual physical war necessarily. It was more of a proxy war that we saw play out in the fields of Korea and Vietnam and other parts of the world, and Africa and Middle East and Southeast Asia. So, but it was never a direct conflict between the Soviet Union, who was the world power, along with the United States. So it was a very interesting time to deal with, particularly in the advent of the atomic age, where you had weapons now that could kill the planet. So it was a very, very tumultuous and stressful time in our history. Also one, though, of great economic growth. The idea that, as we talk about concepts of like classical economic liberalism, which basically makes the argument that economies work best if basically governments stay out of the way and let businesses run the system. And it actually did so for a while, especially the free market system, which was set up after World War II at Bretton Woods conference. And so they created the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and sort of set up trade agreements around the world to be able to basically take the focus off war and put the focus on money and capitalism. And it was relatively successful even throughout the tumultuous periods from post-World War II leading into the 50s and 60s. So you still had this push of rise of nationalism in some of the poorer countries, particularly in the global South, in juxtaposed with the wealth and growth and development of the wealthy countries in the global North. One of the big changes that took place post-World War II was the Marshall Plan, which was a $13 billion aid package to Western Europe to help build the economy in Western Europe. It was also planned for the United States to basically have a foothold in the development and economics of Europe from that point moving forward. But it actually was set up the framework for the East-West rivalries and set up the rise of anti-communist movements that took place during this period of time as well. So when economics took over the game, then that changed the global system completely as we know it. And then moving into the 1950s, in 1951, the European coal and steel community set up a infrastructure to be able to set up tariffs and control production in most of the Western European countries. There were 6 countries that were originally part of what they call the European Economic Community, called the EEC, that was created in 1957 to really try and help Europe become competitive in the global system. And during that time, these countries, their economies just boomed. And so it was really a time of great growth. And this is the EEC is the precursor to what we now know as the European Union. And so with that, the idea was to make sure that the system had evolved from a liberal democracy to one of as what we call social democracy, where you have aspects of free market economy, but you also have kind of extensive social benefits, and the government has has ability to regulate quite a bit in the lives of individuals. However, most of the European countries have had great success with this, and even though people here will sometimes joke and say, well, in Sweden, they get taxed at a 50% or 60% rate. And it's like, yeah, they do, but, if you think about what we pay in taxes, depending on where you are, if you're in the middle class, and you're probably paying a third or more of your income in taxes, and that's just from your base tax, not counting everything you buy, and with gasoline and everything else is taxed. So on average, I think Americans pay about 50% of their income in taxes as well. And we get much less for ours than they get for theirs. So it's a very, very different philosophy. And so it has led to some disagreements between the United States and Europe on aspects of economic development, healthcare, social issues, particularly where there's departure between the United States and Europe on these issues. I often like to say, it's interesting that Europe had its great empires and then got slapped back to reality, and the United States still hasn't had that slap back to reality yet. And so I think once Europe recognized that you have to have a balance between people and money, that helped them be able to build and fortify their system. Yes, they still have conflicts, and yes, there's still divisions because they're historic for centuries and centuries, in some way, shape, or form. But there are also aspects that have that held them together very closely. Now, we do know, of course, as I'm sure you've heard of some of the things that have taken place that are breaking down some of those issues. One, of course, is Brexit, where the Brits had decided, even though I think it was a horrible idea, to exit the EU and go off on their own, which hasn't worked out so well for them yet. But we'll see what happens, or if they wind up back in the EU again. Also, the rise of terrorism in those areas, because they've had an influx of Muslims because of all the wars in the Middle East and rise of ISIS and threats in Syria. So there's millions and millions of Middle Eastern Muslims that are now in France, England, Germany, and Sweden and other parts. And now that issue has gotten even messier for lots of reasons, because you have this clash of religious ideology and perhaps extremism from the Muslims on one side, juxtaposed with the more moderate Christianity versions that exist throughout the rest of Europe. And again, the other aspect that's also a struggle is the fact that most of those Muslims are very poor and disenfranchised. So there's a lot of disdain and a lot of, again, rising of nationalist intentions amongst Europeans, and many of them don't want the Muslims in their countries. So it's an ongoing battle. It's an ongoing structural development of change and contention. But it has certainly still remains to be the moniker of democracy, of economic, social, political success is rooted in the European Union and in Europe itself. And so we owe a great debt to them on one hand, but they've also created some disasters that we still live with in the world today. But that goes without saying for every major country that is a major power on the planet. So that applies to all of it, including us. Okay. I will see you in the next chapter. You guys have a great day.